So last class we didn't get as far as I thought we would, but we'll see what we get through today. So the plan is to continue our discussion of Joshua Greene's dual process model. We didn't have time yesterday for this, but I'm going to show a video of Greene himself giving a kind of rough sketch of his dual process idea, and then we'll dig into the 2015 reading, which, as I say, has a lot of good references if you want to write your paper on something in the same area. Okay, so a nice summary by Greene there. Now, he mentioned in passing the Phineas Gage case. Don't put too much weight on that. There's a lot of doubt about the details of the Phineas Gage case, but what he also mentions in that same section is a study with a sample of people with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which found that people with damage to that part of the brain were much more likely to make the utilitarian decision. So when they don't feel the kind of emotional weight of different decisions, they're more likely to go utilitarian. This is that same part of the brain that Jonathan Haidt talks about. When people have that same part of the brain damage, they are less likely to, or they're less able to act on their knowledge that certain types of bets are more risky or less likely to make them money. They intellectually know that they're going to lose money, but they don't feel the, oh, that would suck if I did that. And if you damage that same part of the brain, people are less likely to, or sorry, more likely to give the utilitarian answer. Another really nice idea that he started off with is the trade-off between efficiency and flexibility, where efficiency is a good feature of automatic mode. So those of you who didn't make it today, so cameras, the old cameras have automatic mode, where you just can point and shoot, you don't have to think about it, and most of the time it works pretty well. So it's high in efficiency. But if you're a bit more sophisticated of a camera user, you may use manual mode, where you can adjust the different features by hand. And there, the nice thing you get is flexibility. I knew a graduate student who worked on AI systems. Apparently several AI, machine learning type systems have a similar kind of dual process structure, where the equivalent of automatic mode is kind of built up by habit. What's worked in the past, okay, we'll just go with that. But if an unusual type of situation comes up, they have manual mode as a kind of backup. So you get the advantages of efficiency for the most part, but when you need the flexible system, it's there, ready to go. Okay, so we already talked about the VMPFC and DLPFC last time. Now, we're going to look at various lines of evidence that for Greene's central claim, which is that automatic mode tends to produce deontological responses. And again, remember last time, he's not necessarily saying that they have an explicit commitment to deontological principles, but just that these are the types of answers that are easier to justify in deontological terms. Whereas manual mode tends to produce utilitarian or consequentialist type responses. Responses that are easier to justify in utilitarian terms. Okay, so people with frontotemporal dementia, which involves emotional blunting, are more likely to make utilitarian or consequentialist decisions. Again, he already mentioned this in the video, but damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, also participants with that are, in that case, about 5 times as likely to make utilitarian or consequentialist decisions. Greene mentions that this was replicated in a separate study in Italy. People who exhibit greater physiological reactivity, so if you measure kind of how much their blood vessels constrict when performing a stressful task, so it's kind of a physiological measure of emotional reactivity, they are less likely to give utilitarian or consequentialist decisions or responses. One piece of evidence that has now been replicated many times, and we'll see later it's going to be used as a criticism of Greene, is the fact that psychopaths are more likely to make utilitarian or consequentialist decisions. Remember back to the Nichols reading, psychopaths have no difference, no systematic difference in terms of their reasoning capacities, or we now might call their manual mode capacities, but they are less emotionally responsive, particularly to the distress of others. So you turn down automatic mode, right? You turn down their kind of emotional reactivity, and you get more utilitarian responses. So as I'll flag this, Kahan is going to replicate this finding and also give further evidence showing that utilitarian responses to these kinds of dilemmas, push the large man in front of the trolley, is associated with all kinds of bad things. Different traits that involve selfishness, less empathy, less care. And what Kahan's going to say is that should make us skeptical that these dilemmas are actually measuring utilitarian tendencies. There's a back and forth there, but in this context, Greene is using it for his side to say, no, this is what we would expect. If utilitarian judgments are driven more by manual mode, or system 2, so again, these are essentially synonymous. If they're driven more by system 2, well, if you turn down system 1 or automatic mode, you should get more utilitarian responses. So I'm just going to go through these. And I won't test you on the details of all these studies. It's just to give you a sense of the cumulative force of the different types of studies that have been done in this area. In every case, you have to bring up the typical concerns, like does this replicate, culturally limited sample, but in totality, you should see that there's a cumulative force to these different studies. So next one, people who are more empathetic, so if you measure their empathy with a scale or something, or if you induce them to be more empathetic with a manipulation, that increases their tendency to give deontological responses. So to say, no, don't push the man in front of the trolley, or don't suffocate the baby to save the other lives. One that you kind of have to squint at this result to see how it supports the dual process model. You could probably think of other ways of interpreting this. If you put people in two conditions, and one of them you make them laugh, make them, put them in a kind of funny mood, they become more likely to say it's okay to push the large man in front of the trolley. Greene's spin on this is if you put people in like a good mood, they're kind of a chuckly mood, you reduce their tendency to feel the negative emotion of the trolley case. They're not as likely to feel, oh, that just feels wrong. You can imagine other interpretations, but that's the spin that he puts on it. Okay, the next finding involves a couple of inferences as well. It's generally been found that visual thinking is more emotionally evocative than verbal thinking. Verbal thinking more associated with reasoning or system 2. And if you measure how much people rely on visual versus verbal thinking, people who have more visual thinking style are more likely to say, don't push the large man in front of the trolley. So you have to keep a couple things in your head for that one. So visual thinking, more emotionally evocative. People who have more visual type thinking are less likely to say, push the large man in front of the trolley. So more visual, more likely to say, don't push the large man in front of the trolley. You can also, this also has been replicated with experiments where you interfere with visual thinking. So if you reduce people's capacity to think visually, you make them more consequentialist. So they don't have that emotionally evocative visual type thinking. So based on the way Greene has put this forward, that means they should be relying more on manual mode, and then what you find is they give more utilitarian responses. Okay, a few more. Greene mentioned this in the video. Consequentialist or utilitarian decisions are correlated with more activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the system 2 type region. Two that I have experimented a bit with, not in the context of trolley type dilemmas, but studies of punishment judgments, are cognitive load and time pressure. These are two ways of taking away people's ability to use system 2 or manual mode. So cognitive load, that'd be like in the video, you give someone a 7-digit number to memorize, and then in the control condition they get a 2-digit number. So the idea is if you take away their capacity to use manual mode, all that's left is automatic mode. They can't think carefully about it because they're busy thinking, 78392, 78392, or whatever the number is. Some studies have found that reduces utilitarian or consequentialist decisions. When I tried this out in the case of punishment, I had trouble replicating this, so maybe take that one with a grain of salt. Similar idea, you can give people time pressure in the experimental conditions, like you have to respond in the next 25 seconds, and some studies find that also decreases utilitarian or consequentialist decisions. Last one I'll mention, because this is one that I've replicated several times myself, is the cognitive reflection test. The paper doesn't use that term, it just calls it tricky math problems. I mentioned this last class in answer to a question. So the cognitive reflection test is a set of what seem like simple math problems where there's an answer that pops into your head that's incorrect, and an answer that requires you to carefully think about it. So the famous one, there's a ball and a bat that together are $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And at least for many people, the answer that pops into their head is 10 cents. But then if you reflect on it, you realize, wait, if that's true, then the bat would have to be $1.10 because add $1 to it. That's $1.20 total. Oh, okay, let me figure this out. And then you come to the correct answer, which is 5 cents. So you give a series of questions like that, and you find that giving utilitarian answers to these dilemmas is positively correlated with people's scores on this test. Not a huge correlation, like in my site it's usually around 0.2, but it is in the positive direction. Okay, so any questions about that? As I say, if there's a couple studies that gave you a little bit of a headache, I won't test you on the details, but you should get a sense of the overall pattern. Okay, I'll briefly mention, so a guy that's going to come up later in more detail is Guy Kahan. So Kahan and Greene, I'm sure they get along in person, but in the literature they are sort of arch enemies. You know, they have two groups of researchers that kind of go back and forth. So Kahan is generally speaking a critic of Greene's approach, and as I already mentioned in passing, we'll see his 2015 paper later in this unit. But a different study that we're not going to read in full, Greene just mentions it here, he says that Greene has kind of stacked the deck in favor of utilitarianism here because he's picked types of dilemmas where utilitarianism has the counterintuitive implication, right? So, yes, most people have the intuition, don't push someone in front of the trolley. And in that case, the utilitarian decision is counterintuitive. So of course, if you use those types of dilemmas as your measure of utilitarianism, you're going to get this pattern where system 2 is correlated with the utilitarian answer. But there are other cases where deontology has the counterintuitive implication. One that I believe I talked about in a prior class was standard deontological or Kantian views say that it's always wrong to lie, even if it's a little white lie that helps people or even saves someone's life. And that's very counterintuitive. Most people are going to have the intuition, no, if you're lying to get the Gestapo away and not look in your house for people you're saving, then it's okay. So I'm not going to get into the details of the evidence. Greene mentions that he did some studies that found that even in cases like that, you still find the pattern that he expects, where careful thinking is correlated with the utilitarian response. You don't have to worry about the details there either, but that's an example of a debate that's in the literature. Greene does concede, though, that probably you will be able to find some exceptions where the association between manual mode and utilitarianism doesn't hold, but he says this is the kind of general pattern. Okay, so next set of studies have to do with the way in which personal force affects people's responses to other sacrificial dilemmas. So ones where you have to sacrifice someone else to save many. This was already mentioned in the textbook. So the crucial one is comparing the trapdoor type dilemma to the switch and the footbridge. So in the standard switch case, so you have to pull a switch to redirect the trolley to kill 1 instead of 5. Most people say that's okay. In the footbridge case, where you have to push someone in front of the trolley, most people say no, that's not okay. The reason that Kantians give for this one not being okay is that's not okay because you're using someone as a means to an end. So the trapdoor is a nice way of seeing if that's actually what's driving people's intuitions here. This is one where you have to pull a switch to release a trapdoor that lets the large man fall in front of the trolley. So if it really is about using people as a means to an end, the pattern of responding here should be similar to here. But in fact, it's similar to the switch case, showing that what's actually driving people's responses is an aversion to putting your hands on someone and pushing them in front of the trolley. And it's pretty hard to think of a principled moral reason why there's a difference between doing this and doing this, when the result in this case is exactly the same. Someone falls in front of the trolley and stops the trolley. Okay, next, there's, in the case of self-sacrificial dilemmas, so think of the case I mentioned in passing last class about, most people think you have a moral duty to go into the shallow pond and ruin your $500 suit to save someone's life. but most people don't think you're morally obligated to spend large amounts of money to save lives in sub-Saharan Africa or wherever it is. Most people think it's good, but they're not going to say, like, you're a bad person if you don't do that. Whereas I think most of us would say you're a bad person if you walk by the child. Greene and a graduate student of his did some experiments, and there you do find that the biggest variable that predicts whether people say you have a duty to do it is spatial distance. Right? The further away you are, the less likely people are inclined to think, yes, you have a moral duty to give your resources to save a life. So that's what's psychologically driving people to make the judgment. But if you reflect on it, it's pretty hard to say that spatial distance morally matters, even though it is what's causing the differences in responding. So that's the empirical half of the paper. The next half of the paper is on the potential philosophical implications of this body of evidence. Before looking at that, any questions about the empirical results that we talked about? Yep.
In the article terms, there's the white lie example.
Yeah, so that's, Kahan says that there are some cases where deontology gives you the counterintuitive example. And therefore, in those cases, you should expect that Greene would be wrong. Greene has kind of stacked the deck because he's picked the kinds of cases where utilitarianism has the counterintuitive example. So of course it'll be correlated with system 2 or manual mode. If you use like the white lie case though, then you should get the opposite pattern. Deontology should be the more reflective system. Now Greene objects to this, and there's arguments back and forth, but it's an objection that's worth knowing about. Any other questions? Okay, so as I say, the next section will be on the potential philosophical implications of this body of evidence. And there are two different routes by which Greene thinks these findings can have philosophical implications. One I drew on in a prior class when we were talking about the is-ought gap. So Greene concedes that the point that we made, or I made when we talked about the is-ought gap, that if you're going to have descriptive statements and infer a normative conclusion, you have to have another normative premise somewhere in the argument. So I stole this example from him. There's the jury case where you could experimentally or descriptively demonstrate that juries are driven by racial bias. Right? That's just purely descriptive. But in order to make the inference that the juries are doing something immoral or something they shouldn't do, you have to have the normative premise. You shouldn't rely on racial bias, or it's morally bad to rely on racial bias. So that's kind of easy. That's an easy case of the direct route. But what someone would object is saying, yeah, but that doesn't change our values. The fact that we are against racial bias, we already had that before we did the experimental work, so that's not very interesting. A case of scientific evidence potentially undermining our values or leading us to question our values is the incest example. So Greene here appeals to a kind of debunking argument that you can think of as being similar to Sharon Street's one, except it's not directed at a general claim like moral realism. It's directed at the particular claim that incest is always morally wrong. And the idea here is, look, our aversion to incest evolved to protect us from the deleterious, or protect our descendants, I suppose, from the deleterious effects of inbreeding, right? If you make a baby with a sibling, the baby is likely to have problems. And so anyone who had genes that made them not like being with siblings, those genes were more likely to get passed on. So the function of incest aversion is avoiding genetic problems. But we can notice, and this part is descriptive, that nowadays that problem, you can avoid that problem. You know, a pair of brother and sister separated at birth or whatever, they could use contraception. So in cases like that, the problem for which incest aversion evolved is no longer relevant. So this can cause us to question that particular intuition. Now again, you still have to have a normative assumption. Yes?
Question with that.
Yeah.
So it's no longer like the evolutionary thing because we can prevent that now, but is it still a crime? Like, isn't it
Oh,
still
well, yeah.
against the law?
No, of course. But what the moral philosopher would say is morality and law are different things. There's overlap, but I think everyone in this room wants to maintain that sometimes laws can be bad. Very easy to think of examples, right? So yes, for the time being, it is illegal, but presumably it's possible for us to reflect and go, well, based on the moral values we hold, do we want to keep these laws or not? But as I was saying, though, in order to draw normative implications, you still have to have the normative assumption that if an intuition was designed to serve a particular function that is no longer relevant, then we shouldn't rely on that intuition. Something like that. You can't just go straight from the evidence to the conclusion. One of the future readings will actually criticize Greene on this very point, but that's one way in which factual or descriptive findings can have these normative implications. The next argument I think is a bit more fun, and that's the indirect route. Greene thinks there's an indirect way that descriptive or factual claims can have normative implications. And here, the argument relates directly to his dual process model of utilitarian versus deontological judgments. Excuse me. So remember, there's these two systems, automatic mode and manual mode. And here's a claim that Greene makes. In the case of the automatic mode settings, yes?
Sorry, could you repeat what you said, indirect way, just what is the indirect way, the first one?
Oh, so the indirect or direct?
Indirect.
So indirect we're going to find out now.
Oh.
So that's what's, there's some build up for that, yes.
Explain the direct route again?
Yes, so an example of the direct route's kind of easier, although potentially less interesting. The jury case would be a direct route. So you find out this descriptive thing, the juries make decisions based on racial bias. We have the normative assumption, we should not rely on racial bias. Okay, conclusion, the juries did something they should not do. So that's one way in which descriptive or factual findings can lead to moral conclusions, but that one's kind of less juicy because it doesn't lead to changing one's values. The indirect way, by contrast, is a way in which empirical findings can lead us to change our values. So there's a distinction, automatic mode versus manual mode. And what Greene says is, in order for automatic mode to become reliable, it must draw on some kind of trial and error experience. So there's different reasons for thinking this. One is just, we know that the way that expert intuitions, for example, become reliable is lots of practice. So intuition is not magical. One thing that if you look at like chess grandmasters, for example, they can look at a board and know what the right move is, even if they can't articulate why. Because they've seen it so many times that coming to the strategic choice is a matter of habit. So through the trial and error practice of playing lots of games, their intuitions have been honed to become more reliable. Greene says there are 3 kinds of trial and error experience that we can have that can make automatic mode reliable. And those are evolution, biological evolution. So evolution is a trial and error process, right? You have random genetic variants emerge. Some of them happen to be adapted to the environment. Most happen to not be adapted to the environment. Those genes run into dead ends. They don't get spread as much. Cultural development, different ways of modeling how that's a kind of trial and error process, but maybe you appeal to memes or something, but there's a story to be told there about how different cultural norms exist today because they were the ones that got passed on, right? Cultures that had goofy practices that didn't allow the cultures to continue, those ones kind of died out. The cultures we have today often have a lot of wisdom built into them. It's kind of a conservative point, but one saying is, traditions are experiments that worked. So that's the thinking there. And lastly, you can have individual learning. So like the chess grandmaster case, if you're exposed to a lot of a particular kind of thing, and you have a kind of trial and error experience with it, your intuitions can then become reliable. Crucially, when Greene speaks of intuitions in the moral sphere being reliable, he does not mean objectively true. You have to read kind of between the lines with his various writings. He seems to mean something like ability to achieve consensus, if you want kind of a fast and loose sense of what he means by reliable. But he accepts arguments like those from Sharon Street. In fact, he wrote his dissertation attacking moral realism. So he's not committed to the view that reliability means objectively true or something like that. Okay, now here's another reason to think that automatic mode can only be reliable with resort to trial and error experience. And that's the no cognitive miracles principle. Now this is an assumption, it's not something that he necessarily proves, but he's kind of encouraging you to adopt this assumption. And he thinks that if you don't, you wind up asserting something kind of difficult to maintain. The idea here is, so we have these gut reactions, this automatic mode. If our gut reactions that we don't think carefully about were reliable without some kind of trial and error experience, that would be a kind of miracle. And in science, we don't want to appeal to miracles. So if there's a kind of moral dilemma that we don't have evolutionary, cultural, or individual experience with, then automatic mode will not be reliable for that kind of dilemma unless we want to bank on cognitive miracles. So here, Greene distinguishes between familiar moral problems and unfamiliar moral problems. So familiar meaning familiar in terms of these sources of learning or sources of reliability: biological evolution, cultural development, and individual learning or experience. So the kinds of dilemmas we evolved to deal with, those dilemmas we should probably trust our gut reactions, right? Our gut reactions are these fancy cognitive gizmos. They're very good at solving the kinds of problems we repeatedly encountered in our evolutionary past. So like, you know, dealing with romantic partners, friendships, those kinds of dynamics, Greene would maintain it's okay to trust our intuitions in cases like that because our intuitions have been shaped to be good at dealing with those kinds of problems. But for unfamiliar moral problems, Greene maintains we should rely on manual mode because we can think carefully through the different implications. So we're kind of encountering it for the first time, so we shouldn't trust our gut. Again, unless we want to assume the existence of cognitive miracles. So, crucially then, yes?
So is he making the point specifically that many situations are only for evolutionary intuitions, or would it also apply to
Any of the three. I may have said evolution in passing as a shorthand, but any of these three, for Greene, is a potential source of reliability. So the crucial thing then is, how do we know when a problem is a familiar one or an unfamiliar one? And Greene gives two different means. One way of deciding is, does it involve a novel situation or technology? Like in the footbridge case, that's going to apply, right? We didn't evolve in evolutionary or even really cultural terms to deal with that sort of problem. Or individually, it's not the kind of thing you encounter very often, right? So none of the three sources of reliability are going to give you reliability in that case. Things like climate change, or the ability to give to life-saving charities far away. These would all be examples of moral problems that we did not evolve to deal with, either in any of these three senses. So that's one way of deciding whether it's a familiar or unfamiliar moral problem. Another way is there a widespread disagreement about the dilemma, even though there's agreement about the non-moral facts? So sometimes people disagree about a moral case because they disagree about the facts. You know, like, I mean, here's one that's on my mind right now. Take the 2020 election, right? So very heated arguments between, let's say, me and members of my, no, I shouldn't say that. But, so people who say, both sides of the debate on whether the election was stolen agree that democracy is good. They disagree on the facts. Was the 2020 election stolen? So that's not a case where people disagree about moral value, they disagree on the facts. Well, as an aside about that, my buddy just yesterday was, do you guys know Jubilee? Like that, they have like these like 25 Republicans versus 1 Democrat. My buddy was on the most recent one, around the 140 mark. I think he did very well. He was debating Ben Shapiro. So if the election is very close, I think my friend gets the credit. That's what I'll say. Okay, anyways, but back to the paper. What was I saying? So yeah, so if there's disagreement about a moral case, even though there's agreement about the facts, the non-moral facts, that is an indirect indication that it's probably an unfamiliar moral problem. Yep.
So is he arguing then that basically if I take enough reps or repetitions at an unfamiliar problem, it will then transfer into being familiar and
Good.
not automatic?
That's a very good point. So I think that could be a potential weakness, because you could just say, yeah, fine, given that he's included this one, individual learning, maybe it's not all that hard to turn it into a familiar moral problem where the intuitions should be trusted. That's a good point. So I think if you thought that through, it could be a potential problem for Greene's argument.
Like, the counter to that would probably be that, I mean, generally through sports and everything, they say 10,000 times is how much you need to do something to make it like a.
Or I think 10,000 hours. This is it's a Gladwell claim. I'm somewhat dubious of that, but
But
maybe.
I
Although
think-
10,000 hours, I mean, you
But I
could
think
become an expert in it.
The counter would be that in all that time and all those reps, as he said, there's gonna be, if it's not the correct intuition, there's probably gonna be something that's going to tell you that within that.
Well, yeah. So, and I guess one thing I will say that's similar to that is, and this is ubiquitous in learning, when you're working through doing those reps, you're probably going to have to rely on manual mode to some degree. Often when you're learning something new, you start off with conscious, effortful learning, and then it turns into habit. So yeah, these are all very good thoughts. Maybe good paper topics, I don't know. Although it's maybe more philosophical, the paper does have to converge on a hypothesis. Sorry, that's not. But then, of course, so the normative implication, though, relies then on an empirical premise, which we just saw a large body of evidence for, which is that system 2 tends to produce utilitarian responses. So then put it all together. For unfamiliar moral problems, we shouldn't rely on automatic mode, because then we have to bank on cognitive miracles. And for these kinds of dilemmas, manual mode tends to produce utilitarian responses. Voila, for unfamiliar moral problems, we should be more utilitarian. So that's Greene's argument. There's several steps in it, but that's the overall structure. And I've already made this point, but Greene concludes by saying that this is a way in which we can expand reflective equilibrium. Remember that in the standard reflective equilibrium case, you put forward principles to explain intuitions. And usually philosophers take the intuitive judgments for granted, but what empirical psychology can do is look at the causes of the intuitions. What are the kinds of cognitive, biological, etc. causes of those intuitions, and are those something that we still, or I should say, after we learn that these are the causes of the intuitions, do we still want to trust them? And his argument for making utilitarian decisions in unfamiliar cases is one example of using that kind of approach. Okay, Greene always takes longer than I thought. So once again, we're out of time. So at least we finished one paper. So we'll come back next class. The next few are a bit shorter. So see you all then.